Welcome to BBC News. The brother of a man who was killed along with his 8-year-old daughter in a speedboat accident in Cornwall says he was a loving father and husband who doted on his family. 51-year-old Nick Milligan, a senior executive at B-Sky B, was thrown from the boat along with the rest of his family when it went out of control. A woman and a 4-year-old boy are in hospital with serious injuries. 2 other girls escaped with minor injuries. Sarah Ransom reports.
The speedboat is now being examined, but it's still unclear what went on. The police are now appealing for more video footage to help build a picture of what really happened yesterday afternoon.
Sarah Ransom reporting. The United Nations Commission on Syria has clarified comments made by one of its officials that there may be evidence of chemical weapons being used by rebels in the country. Carla Del Ponte said testimony from victims and doctors suggested opposition fighters may have used a nerve agent. However, the Commission stressed it had no conclusive findings. Here's our diplomatic affairs correspondent, Bridget Kendall.
The Syrian government has called it an act of war. Bridget Kendall, BBC News.
Well, tonight, the White House spokesman Jay Carney said the US administration had no reason to believe that rebels had been using chemical agents. Let's speak to our correspondent in Washington, Paul Adams. So is that the end of it as far as the White House is concerned? They've batted it away? To have on John Kerry's visit to Moscow this week. That persuasion be, given that this is now against the backdrop of those strikes by Israel? Thank you very much. Anyone retiring after 2016 will no longer be entitled to a state pension based on the employment record of their husband or wife. The change, to be included in Wednesday's Queen's speech, will mean everyone's pension will be based on their own contributions. Ministers say that in time it'll save hundreds of millions of pounds. The BBC is to conduct a separate inquiry covering the time that the presenter Stuart Hall worked at the corporation. A high-profile trial has begun in Munich of a woman accused of being part of a neo-Nazi group which killed 10 people over 6 years. Almost all of the victims were of Turkish origin. Beata Şarpak faces life in prison if convicted. She denies the murder charges. Stephen Evans reports from Munich. Well, speaking to us earlier, Stephen said that demonstrators outside the court are convinced there has been a conspiracy to cover up mistakes by the authorities. You're watching BBC News. Let's remind you of our headlines now. 17 minutes past 9. I'm Martine CROXALL. The headlines at 9:30. Let's take a look at this sports news now from the BBC Sports Centre. We can join Damien. Hello. Yesterday, when hundreds of thousands of marchers gathered in Dhaka to demand stricter Islamic laws, what followed were violent clashes with police that left 15 people dead. Nearly 100 campaigners who want the remains of King Richard III to be buried in York have marched through the city centre today. It's part of the ongoing battle over the final resting place of England's last Plantagenet king, whose bones were discovered under a car park in Leicester earlier this year. Charlotte Leeming reports from York.
For tourists, well, he may have died hundreds of years ago, but this intriguing figure from history is still causing quite a stir in the present day. Charlotte Leeming for BBC Look North in York. Thai curry crickets, barbecue flavour worms and salt and vinegar grasshoppers aren't exactly the sort of things that most people in the UK are used to eating. But could you be persuaded to try them perhaps? Well, insects are regularly eaten by as much as 80% of the world's population, and some researchers say that with rising meat prices, bugs could be the key to solving any future food crisis. John Maguire has been trying some. Well done, John. I think it's the crunch that put me off. Let's take a look at the headlines now on BBC News. Spring has finally arrived and the sunshine seems to have encouraged the fruit trees in the southeast of England to blossom. Unusually, for one farmer in Kent, 4 different fruit tree crops have all come out at the same time. Hello, this is BBC News. I'm Martine CROXALL. The time's approaching 10:15. Claims that Syrian rebels are using chemical weapons are being downplayed by the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on Syria. The US also says it has no information to suggest that rebel fighters have used sarin. Our Washington correspondent Paul Adams told us that President Obama is in a very difficult position. On John Kerry's visit to Moscow this week. That persuasion be, given that this is now against the backdrop of those strikes by Israel. Paul Adams in Washington. You're watching BBC News. Let's remind you of our headlines.
David Cameron is holding an international conference on Somalia tomorrow, aimed at getting more direct funding to support the Somali government rebuilding the country after years of civil war with Islamist rebels. The UK already gives £80 million a year in aid. Our correspondent Andrew Harding begins his report in Afgoy, just outside the capital Mogadishu, on the progress made in restoring order to the country. Anti-gun campaigners in the United States have expressed alarm after a group dedicated to making firearms more widely available announced it had created the world's first working gun to be produced by 3D printer technology. The organisation now plans to put the design on the internet. Our science reporter Rebecca Morell saw the handgun being test-fired in Texas. Nearly 100 campaigners who want the remains of King Richard III to be buried in York have marched through the city centre today. It's part of the ongoing battle over the final resting place of England's last Plantagenet king, whose bones were discovered under a car park in Leicester earlier this year. Charlotte Leaning reports now from York.
Bring him home! Bring our Richard home! Bring him home now! Bring him home!
Now, the weather forecasters say parts of the UK enjoyed their hottest day of the year so far today. Harden in Wales recorded a temperature of more than 20 degrees. Well, for once, the good weather has fallen on a bank holiday, as Daniela Ralph found out. Well, in a moment, we'll find out what the weather's going to do tomorrow, but first, 11:30 with our paper reviewers. Let's take a look at the weather forecast now. Here is Nick Miller.